Here we go. Now we're live. Good evening, Augustonians, and welcome back to Lit Friday. And a huge welcome to anyone joining us for the first time. Lit Friday is a monthly digital program that takes place on the final Friday of each month, where I engage writers, artists, and thinkers from the African diaspora. I want to take a moment also to recognize Ketanji Brown Jackson as she navigates the Supreme Court confirmation hearing proceedings during this time. While these proceedings have been challenging at times and insulting at others, to say the least, Brown is an example of our ability to meet the terms of the political realities we live in and then supersede them to reveal their limitations and possibilities for improved change. Next month, on April 29th, we have the Lambda Literary Award finalist, Crystal A. Smith, joining us to talk about her recent poetry publication, This Is Not About Love. The poet Jason B. Crawford writes, "What is a love poem if not a declaration of the ways we love ourselves through others? In This Is Not About Love, Crystal A. Smith does just that, showing us pain and healing and loving on yourself. Smith writes, forgiveness is not a weapon. It is a learning. It is a lesson to give to yourself. And this is so true and evident in this collection. This Is Not About Love by Crystal A. Smith is not about shame. It's not about holding grief. It's not about sorrow. Crystal is writing about forgiveness, and we all needed that. And so Crystal will be with us discussing that publication, This Is Not About Love, on April 29th. And so moving on to our very, very honored guests for this evening, Marques Red and Mikael Owunna. Mikael Owunna is a queer Nigerian-American multimedia artist and engineer, exploring the intersections of visual media with engineering, optics, Blackness, and African cosmologies. Owunna's work has been exhibited across Africa, Asia, Europe, and North America, and been collected by institutions such as the National Museum of Art, Museum of Fine Arts Houston, Equal Justice Initiative, Duke University Pratt School of Engineering, and National Taiwan Museum. His work has also been featured in media ranging from the New York Times to CNN, NPR, Vice, and The Guardian. He has lectured at venues including Harvard Law School, World Press Photo in the Netherlands, Tate Modern in the UK, and TEDx. Owunna has published 2 monographs, Limitless Africans from Photo Evidence in 2019, and Cosmologies from Clamp Art in 2021. Marques Red is a traditional African cosmologist, independent scholar, and multimedia artist. Red's published academic essays include Astro Black Mythology, the Poetry of Sun Ra, and Those Mysteries Are Mysteries, Ishmael Reed and the Construction of a Black Esoteric Tradition. And he has contributed essays for arts institutions and galleries, including Clamp Art, Silver Eye Center for Photography, and Women of Visions. In October of 2021, he and Owunna launched a public art collaboration with the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra entitled Playing the Cosmic Strings. And they're working on a series of glass sculptures that I cannot wait to see that will be exhibited at the Pittsburgh Glass Center. Red is also currently writing a scholarly text entitled Ancient Origins, Future Destinies, Blackness, World Creativity, and the Word. And we would love to have you back to discuss when you're ready to release it to the world. But again, welcome, Marques and Mikael. I'm excited to speak about the film that both of you co-directed, and you have things to share with us before we start the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessica. It's really it's amazing to be here and to be in conversation. We're so excited to, continue. We had a Lit Friday before where we spoke, and then also now to share the progression with the artistic practice. So I'm going to share some slides where we're going to talk about our film, Obi Umbu, The Primordial House, and then we'll open it up for a conversation.
Awesome. I'm going to disappear so everyone can focus.
Okay. So it's really just really amazing to be here. We had the Pittsburgh premiere at the Kelly Strayhorn Theater and at the end of February. And so, we're really excited to talk about the film and in additional depth and detail. And so just a bit about the film. So Obi Umbu, it's titled Obi Umbu, The Primordial House, an Igbo Creation Myth. It's a 30-minute experimental film that presents a West African narrative about the emergence of the universe. And so it's done through a choreographed dance performance. And it's the first of its kind to be shot completely under ultraviolet light. And so we see this film suffused with a cosmic aura, which is amplified by the fluorescent paint that illuminates the bodies of the two principal dancers, Victoria Watford and Corey Boupinier of Pittsburgh Ballet Theater. And it's also one of the parts that was also really amazing in working on this film was that it became an extension of my photographic process. So I'd been working with ultraviolet portraits and fluorescent paints to create cosmic portrayals and of the Black body that are then grounded in African cosmologies. And so moving into moving images was just an incredible step for my artistic process, and then also in the collaboration with Marques.
And for a little bit of context about the film, I would add that the film came about through a very interesting and complex artistic, spiritual, and intellectual process. I started a book club at the beginning of the pandemic around March, April of 2020. And Mikael and I and a few others, we plowed through a ton of books about African spirituality, where we delved into many different traditions, including ancient Egyptian, the Dogon, the Dagara, and the Igbo. So we spent a lot of time in different West African and ancient Egyptian contexts. One of the books that we read was called Lepers of the Magical Dawn by Nze Chukwudibia Nwafor. And this book was, the subtitle was Science and the Cosmological Foundations of Igbo Culture. And it was there that we found this particular myth that is at the heart of the film. And we were struck when we read it because it is about a dancing deity that helps to create the world. And because Mikael has had such a history of photographing dancers and engaging with dance has been an important part of his earlier artistic process, this seemed like a perfect narrative to tackle for this new medium. And overall, I would say our goal in our project has been thinking about how to recover, modernize, and extend traditional African knowledge systems and African cosmologies. And this project was the perfect venue to do that. And we will now show you a 1-minute trailer from the film to give you a taste of what it's about. Okay, so hopefully that was enough to whet your appetite. And so we'll also give you a little bit more detail about the film, and we'll take you through the 4 acts of it as well and give a brief synopsis. So this image on the screen is from the first act of the film, which is called Chukwu in a Secret Chamber. So at the beginning of the world, before creation happens, we have these 2 deity figures, Chukwu and Ekene Chukwu, and they are these primordial figures who exist in perfect unity in and as the blackness of space. So we have these 2 figures who are we can think of them as the masculine and feminine polarities of the cosmos, but together they are dual aspects of this primordial androgynous blackness that then becomes the world in which we live. So all is perfect in this primordial unity until Chukwu, the male figure, decides to section off a part of space exclusively for himself in the form of the sacred pillar chamber in the heart of the primordial house that you see there. And he's engaging in this secret work by dancing in and out of this chamber. And because he's doing this in secrecy and introduces secrecy into their relationship for the first time, this dancing in and out of the chamber inspires curiosity in his feminine counterpart, Ekene Chukwu. And we can see her staring at the chamber to see what's going on.
So Act 2 of the film, so the film is broken into a 4-act structure, and which is also a really spiritually potent numerological concept in Igbo cosmology. And so in the second act of the film, the second act is entitled The Decision of Eke ne Chukwu. And so here, Chukwu has now sectioned himself off into this sacred pillared chamber, and he disappears inside of the chamber, which you can see behind her. She begins spinning on a cosmic loom, which within the Igbo context is also a prefiguration of string theory and all of the infinite strings that form creation itself. And as she's spinning on this loom, she's you could see her as kind of the tension in the film mounting as she is going between the loom and the chamber and weaving a plot into the loom itself. And so as she's doing that, she decides that she will risk the equanimity of the first world, because at the beginning, they were all one in this primordial blackness until Chukwu separated himself from her into this chamber. And so she takes this plot from the loom and she enters into the chamber, Chukwu's mystical chamber, to uncover the mystery that's happening within it.
So the next act, Act 3, is called What Becomes of Death. And it turns out that Ekene Chukwu's entrance into the chamber was a major taboo, which caused a massive explosion that simultaneously created the universe and martyred her. Chukwu comes and discovers her lifeless body. He cries tears of grief. And those 3 stands that you see there are the containers that hold his tears, which he uses to enact this moment of purification and healing, and literally paint her back into life.
And Act 4 is entitled The Separation. And so as Chukwu cries these tears of purification and then paints them onto her body, Ekene Chukwu rises from the dead. And as she rises from the dead, they now exist as dualistic forms. So you even see it in the paralleling of the paints on their bodies. So now we have dualistic forms that come into the world and into being, as the physical universe is now incarnated on Ekene Chukwu's body. So we can actually see ourselves and the physical universe, all of us existing on Ekene Chukwu's body. And so as these dualistic forms come into existence, now the pure spiritual state of the universe is lost. And so you see Chukwu never fully recovers from the traumatic shock of the shattering of the primordial state, that shattering of that primordial blackness. And disenchanted at the end, we see him withdraw completely and permanently from the world back into his secret chamber. So that's just a little overview of the film and the plot structure that we explore in the work.
Oh yeah, we also like to give a shout out to Ursula Payne, who we worked with. She's the chairperson of the dance department at Slippery Rock University, who was our movement director. And she worked with us as we were developing a dance language for expressing the story and the myth.
Mm-hmm.
This is all incredible. Watching the trailer, I was totally enthralled. I was totally mystified. I've never seen anything quite like this before. And as Mikael has already stated, like, this is the first film that's been done through this lens, right? That you as you said it many times, developed while you were finishing up your engineering degree and deciding to go into film itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in, even in response to that, because I think that was part of the goal of what we were hoping to do. Because, I mean, as we understand the contemporary hierarchy of knowledge, traditional systems from Africa are usually relegated to the bottom of that caste system. So we were wanting to recover those systems, but also say, okay, how can we use the most avant-garde technologies, the most modern mechanisms that we have access to? How can we formally push the boundaries in bringing them back to life? So we're not wanting to just say, okay, well, we're just trying to recover them, but we're also trying to project them out into the future as well, and use them as a beacon of light to guide us into our new futures also.
So one question that I do have is, I have so many questions, but the first thing I have is you both mentioned working on dance language together with the help of Ursula Payne. And so I was wondering about the very practical ways that you worked together and what you both contributed, because this is really about interdisciplinarity, experimentation, and taking risks. So I don't, it's like not coming strictly from a dance background, but having access to dance via Blackness, right, and Africanity. Maybe not having much of a background in film. Mikael, I know this is your first film that you've done, and remember you speaking about it with lots of excitement and trepidation. So what were the practical maneuverings you all had to do as partners and also as both collaborators and contributors to this project? It's a huge undertaking.
Yeah, I think we understood the scale of it more and more as we were going through the process, I would say, and so I think Marques can talk a bit more specifically about the form of the collaboration in terms of the movement piece. But I would say that, we came in with, very humble, I would say. And I think all of us in the room, for all of us, it was our first film that we'd worked on. The dancers, it was their first film. For Ursula, I'm pretty sure it was her first film that she participated in. It was for Marques and I. It was also our first film, and so we really came in with an open spirit of thinking about how do we do service to these stories, and so every time we would even look at the movement, we would go back to what is this? What is the myth? What is the story? And for us, we were really driven by a hunger to revive these African myths that have been suppressed for centuries. And even the story, I just kind of as like a preface in terms of like the urgency that it kind of came up for all of us in terms of the creation was even my family members. So it's an Igbo creation story. My family, Nigerian, were Igbo. And even my family members who grew up in Nigeria have never heard the story before. Wow. Our own cosmologies, our own ideas of how the universe came into being have been mostly erased. And so I think we were all just, even though we had different skill sets, and we were all like, okay, how do we use all of our skill sets collaboratively to come to the service of the story and to modernize and extend it for 21st century audiences for the first time? Mm-hmm.
And I think we brought every piece of our background to this project. And in many ways, it's the culmination of many of our disparate trainings and work in a variety of different settings. So my background in particular, I have a PhD in English literature. And I think that helped me with helping to craft the actual story elements of it. So we knew we had a myth, but we still had to shape it. We had to organize it, breaking it down into 4 different acts. And then even within the act, knowing that we needed certain kinds of emotional crescendos and falls. And so literally sitting down with Ursula to say, okay, from the 35-second mark to the 1 minute, 25-second mark, we need this kind of emotional thing to happen in order to set up the conclusion of this act, in order to set up the next piece that we need to tell. I mean, so I think it was an attention to the structure and details of narrative, and to organization. And even when it came down to the editing and the special effects, when Mikael and I, we were kind of thinking about how to edit all of the raw footage to say, okay, well, if we want this kind of symbolism, we need to set the groundwork for it in these ways. And we need this kind of shot here because an angle from this particular perspective will illuminate this aspect of the story. So I think I could bring that piece. And even my own spiritual explorations. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in a multitude of African traditions. Probably the most will be in Santeria, which is an Afro-Cuban spiritual tradition. So having spent time in Cuba, having seen how rituals there work and the dances and the pageantry, and being able to say, okay, how can we bring certain elements of that kind of a visual style into this particular format and language we're trying to create? And I mean, I think the same was for Mikael too, because he had the photographic background. part of the question was like, okay, well, what would it mean to bring photographs to life in a certain way? And because in photographs, you have to organize the flash and the light in certain ways that you can't really do in a film, because you have people that are moving. We need kind of a 360 view. So we're having to say, okay, well, given your technical piece and your background, how can we push you so that we can have some interesting thinking about how to use ultraviolet light and movement together? So I think it was a matter of saying, okay, we have all of these different strands in our background. How do we elevate ourselves collectively? And how do we push our practice into new ways, into a higher level?
Yeah, because I would say also just that also the way that we do storytelling in photography is so different than in film, right? Because in photography, you're organizing everything, the lights, the body position, the paints, everything, the mise en scène there is all in just one. You're trying to get it just for one shot, for one frame, and so it's a very different approach, because I would say I try to pack all the drama into one moment, right? Like, so because we want people to kind of see it, feel the visual impact, be drawn into the image, and then maybe sit with the text and then learn about the African myths, etc. Here, with a 30-minute film, it's like you have to have, I think this is also where Marques's background in English and literature was so important, was okay, how do you set up a story? How do you set up the characters? How do you then build up their relationship for viewers? How do you build that tension? How do you then have the climax? How do you have these ebbs and flows that are then evoked across a piece versus in just one moment? Was something that I think Marques's training was so key in like pulling that out in every moment. So that was another part that was so helpful in the collaboration.
And I like what you said too, Mikael, about packing everything into one punch in a photograph, because that also led to some interesting conversations and dilemmas that we had to think through. So particularly in the painting style that's used for the photographs, everything is kind of, I don't want to say static, but all in one kind of frame. But when we're painting for the film, okay, so if you have somebody who's dancing for an hour, they're going to sweat.
They
so
need
you're going to have to just
exactly.
So even just the actual materiality of how to rethink the process for this new medium just inspire all kinds of conversations and creative adaptions and extensions of earlier processes that Mikael and I have been engaged in.
And so thinking about transatlantic slavery and its various forms of continuation in the Americas, and in particular the United States, and then thinking about the transference of many core aspects of transatlantic slavery to Africa post-slavery for colonization, right? Which is this process of like separating people from the land, separating people from their self-determination and their recognition amongst their other groups, separating people from, the means of production of natural resources on their land and within their communities. And I'm thinking about the age-old question that we always face as like a global Black community, is this in particular being very specific to the Igbo community accessible for African-American people or Black people in the Americas? Or is it accessible, as Mikael has said, even to the community in which the knowledge has been erased via colonial and missionary processes, right? And how did you guys think about the question? Did you even address it? And then whether you did or not, what's the bridge for you between the two? Because I think as Black people, period, we're always trying to negotiate a sense of home while also always having to relearn the ways that coloniality have rendered our ability to see the similarities in ourselves to be really difficult or sometimes fraught. And so I'm wondering about how you all have negotiated this question that's just like at the core of Black and African studies, period.
So I think that's a really exciting question, and one that Marques and I talk a lot about, like all the time. So Marques can focus on the transatlantic piece. I'll focus on the part in terms of the kind of the post colonial aspect that you also evoked. I think one of the pieces in terms of the on the continent in Nigeria that I think is really important to note is that, for example, Nigeria has the third largest film industry in the world, Nollywood.
Nollywood.
So we have the third largest film industry in the world. Why has this story never been told in film before? Ever. Why is there not more attention in Nollywood, resources dedicated to creating film adaptations of our indigenous stories and myths and cosmological systems? And so I think there we see how even on the continent, as you said, these myths are not, first, they're not even rendered accessible to the population. Many people have lost them through time, but even the powers that be on the continent are not investing in African cosmologies in a really mass way. And so I think almost like we see actually more interest and attention given to African systems, myths, revival in an American context than you even see on the continent, in many ways, in Nigeria, for example. And so not saying that there aren't people who are working to revive it, but Marques and I, we were even talking with a Kenyan filmmaker who they're doing work in Nairobi, literally creating films that are shorts that are dedicated to different myths from different Kenyan ethnic groups, myths of origin. And she was like, it was so amazing seeing your work because, here it's such an uphill battle. People are not interested. And it's like, wow. So I think that shows on kind of on the continental end spectrum, some of the barriers that are faced there, and also the strategic decisions from Nollywood that are being made from production companies to not invest in traditional African cosmological systems and traditional African cosmology. So I think you see a lot more of that actually interest coming from a transatlantic context.
Yeah, this is such a rich question. I mean, especially because Mikael and I, we have talked about, debated, and really gone deep into the politics of the like diaspora from so many different angles, both personal, familial, societal, et cetera, et cetera. And I do think this film touches on some of those issues in many ways. One, building off of the point Mikael just made about some of the lack of interest in some of these dynamics on the continental side, it is interesting that the cast of the film is predominantly African-American. So the two dancers, myself, and the choreographer. I mean, so that's the vast majority of the people working on this project. So I do think there is a very live strain within African-American culture that seeks to build diasporic bridges to think about diasporic reconstruction. One, for accessing the kinds of spiritual power that are embedded in those systems. Two, as a way to navigate and provide some kind of defense and offense against the white supremacist structure we live in here in America. And also because it just is an untapped artistic reservoir that has an important part to play in buttressing identity and these kinds of things. I think within the film itself, there are some interesting and subtle Pan-African touches, so that even though it's a Igbo story, there are ways in which other West African and African-American influences do work their way in. So for instance, if you look at the walls of the set, so the walls of the primordial house itself, and we do include some spiritual ideograms, particularly from the Dogon West African context, particularly symbols that evoke the star Sirius, which is an interesting connection to the film because in the Igbo conceptualization, the primordial house was located in the Sirius star system. And there's a lot of interesting astrological and astronomical fixation with that particular place in the heavens in many different African traditions. So that's one way in which we try to link the story to other contexts. And even if you look at the pillar itself after the explosion, the motifs of the explosion that are drawn on the pillar or that are painted on the pillar mimic the work of Aye Atun, who was a painter that worked with the jazz musician Sun Ra and painted many of his backdrops. So you can even see a kind of an African-American painting influence that has kind of worked its way into the film as well.
So I want to keep talking about this idea of mythology. My own work in my PhD focuses on like African cosmology and Black epistemologies of creating new epistemologies, especially in performance art by Black women. And so I'm always thinking about the words that we choose. And so sometimes I'm like, maybe it's a para-reality. Maybe it's a parallel reality that's happening at the same time. Instead of a myth or an oral tradition or a mythos, because I think sometimes these oral traditions are histories, right? They are at one point reservoirs for remembering certain historical events, like Oriki from the Yoruba experience, like the long praise poem, not only tells a mythos, but that mythos is only mythos because the symbology stands in for real historical events that are preserved through the metaphor. And so I'm thinking about when we think of Blackness, Black people, the work we do in scholarship is often to reveal how ideas of race are a part of creation myths for whiteness in terms of an idea of superiority, right? So whiteness has its own creation myth, but I think that's a way different approach to the idea of mythology than what you all are doing. And so I wanted you guys to kind of talk about how you're approaching the idea of mythology and what that means to you, right? As opposed to an oppressive form of mythology that's meant to disenfranchise a world of people as a way to prove one's own superiority, which is kind of like a general frame for many Western mythologies that we encounter.
Okay, that's a massive question. Okay, so the question, as I understand it, is how do we approach and how do we understand mythology in
your project? Yeah.
Project. Yeah, so I would say, there's a lot to say here. So on one hand, since I mentioned Sun Ra, I will also invoke him again because he has this interesting idea that he calls myth science, where those modes of knowledge are actually not separate, but fused and one of the same in a very interesting way. And I would put that alongside the French philosopher Schwaller de Lubitsch, who talks about ancient Egypt specifically, but I think that applies in this case as well, where he talks about ancient Egyptian knowledge as a quote unquote sacred science. And what you see there is not the separation between subject and object as we are familiar with in our current knowledge systems, but you get this rich multidimensional fusion of art, religion, and science that works through these very potent symbols and rituals to expand and divinize human consciousness. So literally the Knowledge Project becomes about helping people understand and tap into this kind of divine presence within and literally become deities or to become God in a way. And I would say this story works in the same kind of way. So we have many different levels of knowledge that are being encoded through the symbols and the different areas of the story that are being told. And so on one hand, as Mikael was saying earlier, with the weaving on the cosmic loom, we get a sense about string theory and the way in which literally elements are formed, atoms are formed and held together. We also get a commentary about the specific arts of women with weaving and the importance of that art in maintaining certain kinds of cultural stability, etc. With the story of Chukwu and Ekene Chukwu, we also get this kind of metaphysical narrative about the hidden or the sort of metaphysical aspect of reality that Chukwu represents by being in the chamber versus the form of reality, the material form that we see in the form of Ekene Chukwu's body. So in the story, we get everything from gender relations to physics to metaphysics, all in one condensed form. And it's interesting too, because these are stories that work on many different levels. So on one hand, we see Ekenechukwu working and weaving on the loom, but even within the everyday life of the people, you would see children playing the kind of string games on their fingers, this kind of cat's cradle games, et cetera. So even in the everyday life, you can see how these larger cosmological ideas function in just an everyday context. And then thinking about the primordial house from which creation emerges helps us also think about everyday architecture in Igbo land and how houses were organized and constructed. Also giving us a sense about the purpose of life being to reconstruct the primordial unity that was lost and that we came from. So I would say, even though it's called myth, the myth is a very robust kind of knowledge system that's able to synthesize many different areas and push us forward in a spiritual journey.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, you know, I think one of the tensions that can emerge for, I think, for people in the West when they hear the word myth is that they think it's fiction, right? I think there's this assumption that myth means fiction. And it's fascinating because a thinker that Marques and I spent a lot of time with is Malidoma Somé, the Dagara spiritualist from Burkina Faso, who just recently passed away. And Malidoma describes how within the Dagara context, there was no word for fiction because there was no distinction between, quote unquote, the imagination and reality, because anything that you, quote unquote, imagine can be made manifest. Mm-hmm. And so I think I would kind of just start there by saying myth is not fiction. And I think that's also one of the pieces that was really important, because myth is a science, as Marques has kind of described in really amazing detail. And myth is also provides a framework for ritual practice too. And so one of the other parts, Jessica, that you brought up was about how, you know, speaking about for the Yoruba context, how these epic narratives, these myths also encode real, quote unquote, real historical events. I mean, you know, again, what is reality? But it encodes actual events that have been proven on historical record, right? And I think just one of the pieces that is really interesting too is that within the Igbo context, we divide the historical ages of the universe into 4 world ages. Mm-hmm. And so these are Ugaka, which is the age of the primordial unity, which is what you see in the film at the beginning, and ends in Ugachi, which is the emergence of kind of the separation and individualization. Then after Ugachi, you have the era of Ugawu, where as humans become kind of individually conscient, they then begin building and develop ritual practices that they then use to connect back to the primordial house and the creator. So this is when you see the great age of civilizations, ancient Egypt, you know, all of these great civilizations that rise at this time. And also the rise of patriarchy at the time that they also describe within the myth. And at the end of this age, the age that we're currently in is Ugazi, the age of suffering. At the end of the age of Ugawu, the great sages saw what was to come and decided to hand none of their deep mystical secrets on to the next generation, because they knew that anything that's developed in the age of Ugazi is used to destroy. And so I think if you think about us, the myth saying that we're in the age of Ugazi, and then you think about transatlantic slavery, you think about kind of just the state of the world we're in. But one of the things that's also really important in terms of the myth is that this is all cyclical. And at the end of the age of Ugazi, we re-enter into the age of Ugaka, that primordial state, the primordial unity. And so even with the film in terms of its engagement with myth is also a ritual call that can then invoke the return of the exit from Ugazi and the return of the primordial house and the primordial unity. So even as we present the film and people are watching the film, they're also invoking and ritualistically entering back into a path to lead us out of this age of suffering back into the next age of unity, where we're undifferentiated from one another, and we have undifferentiated from the creator themselves. So I think that's also an interesting aspect of the myth and how it's engaged in the film, and what that means in terms of how an artistic practice was used historically to really transition us between the great ages of the universe.
And I'm always struck as well by like the similarities and the concept of the dikenga from certain Congolese groups. There's also this cyclical rising and falling concept where you start in the unified and the primordial, right? It's a fluidity. It's all life, energy, plants, planetary, human, animal together. And then you reach birth. And then you reach the height of kind of like your energetic expense, which is when you're supposed to be reaching human maturity through communal participation and doing work on yourself, and how then you kind of come to your rest, hopefully with peace, and then kind of enter back into that unified state again. Or even thinking about that in terms of the Egyptian Book of the Dead as well, and the similarities there, how you have to pass through trials in order for you to even get to the point of having your heart weighed against Mot's feather. And if your heart is too heavy, just like in the Congolese cosmology, if you haven't resolved yourself, then you can't pass on into continuity. You fall away into oblivion. And so it's these structurally similar, but symbolically nuanced and specific structures that are very, very exciting. And I also see their reflection in, Black life, as Africa as an idea becomes extended beyond a geographical boundary via its people and their movement. So it's like always like exciting, like to be in these conversations where this knowledge becomes like up to the forefront, right? It becomes a thing that's more real in its immediacy and its presence. But speaking of Sun Ra, I also was thinking about Jana Komfra's The Last Angel of History, which is something that I love, which features Ismail Reed. I think about the resurfacing of the history of the Zambian participation in the space race, and the movie Afronauts by Francis Bodomo that it's based on. But there's actually a documentary that's kind of focusing on this, space pursuit in Zambia. And those are only a few examples, right, of your influences. But what are other inspirations that you guys took on? And also, how do you feel your project departs from those inspirations that are so foundational to the work that you're doing?
So one other film I'll kind of also just add into the mix that, we've also we haven't had a chance to see it yet, but we've really wanted to see it, is Neptune Frost. It's an Afrofuturist film. It was at the and they also have like certain sequences where they're also exploring the interfaces between with black light, etc. So it's also really interesting to see how they've been engaging Afrofuturism and also African myth. We also, in terms of African filmmakers, I think there's two Kenyan collectives that are really interesting. One is the Nest Collective, also based in Nairobi, and they have had some really interesting short films that have also engaged with African traditional myths and mythical storytelling. There's also this collective, ASFA, which is the Art and Science Films Africa, where they've done some really fascinating work exploring Kenyan myths. So that was actually with our engagement with the producer, Wangechi, who was talking about kind of the barriers she was facing, being like, okay, I'm based in Kenya, we're making this work, but it is so hard to even get people interested or to even get funding, etc. So I think those would be, some of the additional influences in terms of people who we're in conversation with from a film and visual style perspective, as the way we've been thinking about too.
I would say we spend a lot of time reading anthropology, a lot of French anthropological reports from the 1930s, with some of the initial context between anthropologists and, let's say, the Dogon tribe and some of those other Malian groups. I would say I heard you call to your cat Zora earlier. So Zora Neale Hurston, of course.
That's who she's named after.
Yeah, so of course, Zora Neale Hurston is an important, also anthropological voice who's interested in capturing Afro-diasporic spirituality in many different locations. We also looked at Maya Deren's film about Haiti and Vodun, which I think was an important predecessor as well. So yes, I would say those were some of our major inspirations. So some of the groups Mikael mentioned, and digging into anthropology and other artists that have worked at that intersection of religion, anthropology, spirituality, and media.
And from a traditional perspective too, the motifs that we drew on the wall to decorate the set were directly inspired by uli motifs. So uli is a traditional Igbo artistic style that was done by Igbo woman artists to adorn the shrines within the village. And each of these shrines and all these motifs also encoded language, an entire language about astronomy, the movement of the stars, a ritual practice. And so we also were looking at specific images of uli motifs that adorn different shrines in Igbo land, and then using those in terms of actually adorning and creating the set for that to illustrate and build the space of the primordial house. So I would say that's also one of the ancestral artistic traditions that we were also pulling from.
And I mean, if we want to even go back further than that too, and we could also say, I mean, being influenced by the deities themselves. I mean, so as I mentioned before, I mean, it really was a combined aesthetic, intellectual, and spiritual process. I mean, so there were times where I would do guided meditations with the entire cast, and we would actually invoke Chukwu and Ekene Chukwu. We would go into trance and go into the sacred pillared chamber and ask the figures themselves to show us how they wanted to be represented in dance and how they wanted us to move. So there's also a process of trying to, again, in the Western context, art is this endeavor that's done just for art's sake. It's focused on the form and the color and the technical aspects. Whereas in African context, art had a function. Art was meant to facilitate and push a spiritual conversation, and it was meant to have an impact on human consciousness. And so we wanted that understanding of art to be reflected in our process as well. So it seemed to be very important to have the figures we were representing have some voice. I mean, of course, we know about different modes of spirit possession and other ways of engaging with these transcendental forces. And we wanted to have that in the mix too. And so some of the movements that you will see in the film literally were inspired by those ritual and meditation sessions. And we literally pulled that and just plopped it right into the film itself.
Yeah.
So many different levels of influences. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think one of the pieces that was really exciting there in terms of the joint spiritual and artistic process is that, so actually after filming was completed, remember the story with Tori. And so Victoria Watford, who was the female lead for the film, she think kind of having some different, she had gone to some type of, how was it that she actually, Marques, how was it described again? That she found out more or less that her spirit guide protecting her life was Eke Netchuku, the deity who she'd invoked within the film itself. And so you see actually the joint spiritual artistic process then actually affecting and moving through us as after the film as well. And so I think the last part I also wanted to kind of bring up really quickly was in terms of asking the deities to actually show you the movement. So this is actually evoked even within an Igbo context. There's this really acrobatic dance known as atilogu, where people, where you see these dancers literally jump on top of each other's shoulders, and they make these almost these pyramids in the sky that are as big as like trees. Like we see them, like they're like holding each other and they're doing making this huge formations in the sky. And the story of how the dance was invented was that the individual who invented the dance, he went up into a tree, the highest tree in the village, I believe, something like that. He went up into a tree and he stayed there for 4 days. And he stayed there and he asked the tree, how do I make the most incredible dance that has ever been created? And he stayed up there and literally waited and waited and waited. And then the tree told him how to actually create this dance that would literally create a formation of human beings as tall as the tree itself. And so that's actually how you see, actually, by communicating with spirits, communicating with ancestors, you can actually create artistic projects that transcend what is seen as possible for the human body alone.
Yeah, I mean, because of course, I mean, and neither one of us were filmmakers before we did this film. Right. I mean, so, I mean, it was certainly a process of ancestral invocation, calling every spiritual device we could to help us actually have the eye and the vision to be able to put all of this together, to learn the software we needed to learn, to make sure we got the camera angles and the footage that we needed, that we didn't even know we needed when we were doing it. But then months later, it's like, oh my God, thankfully, we ended up getting this piece that we thought we would never use because this will now be the centerpiece of this particular moment. Yeah, so I would say all of those things went into building the foundation for what we were trying to do with the project.
No, the consistent practice and communication delivers. You got to be specific. For sure. And I'm very interested in this process, right? Because I think that for a lot of artists, right, of the African diaspora, more and more what I'm hearing is this process of spirituality as being part of the creative process. Without the participation in, ancestral communication, nothing gets done, right? And so there's almost like this informed, right, through people educating themselves and like being in community, but also very kind of internal blood memory impulse to participate or find ways to participate, even if you don't have the information that maybe a book or an elder can give you. And so it's amazing and fascinating and reparative to hear that this is a part of the process of your process as well. And so I have more of like a filmmaker question, and it's our last question. And I wish I could keep going for another hour and 30 minutes, of course. But so your debut was in Los Angeles. And since then you've premiered in New York, you've premiered in Pittsburgh with the Kelly Strayhorn Theater. And as the film gathers its own life in the public, how do you perceive the reception of it amongst different audiences, and what's surprising and what was expected?
So I would say first, I can answer in terms of some of the Nigerian diasporic responses. And so I would, okay, so, sorry. My family members are very, very Christian, very Christian. So I would say that we did several rounds of pre-screenings of the film before the debut. And when we did the pre-screening with some of my family members, I was very nervous because, particularly this whole resurrection, this whole piece of this really beautiful poetic story, but one that, people in Nigeria typically the response is to reduce anything traditional or about our cultures and our spirit and our spiritual systems to being devilish and of the devil. And so I was a little nervous when they were watching the film. I was like, oh, here we go. And they were so moved and excited. They were like, this is incredible. This makes me so proud to be an Igbo person. I've learned so much from this story. I've never heard this story before, even once you go up in Nigeria. I love it. I think that was really exciting because if we had just approached them with like a whole ritual, you know what I'm saying? Like in terms of like, oh, here's, I'm saying, here is the icon of XYZ, etc. There would be this type of almost visceral reaction. But showcasing the story as a film, because of, I think, the way in which film works for 21st century audiences, it was such a powerful invitation for them into the work and into Africa, into Igbo myths and creation stories and Igbo spirituality in a way that they otherwise would be completely closed off from. So I think that was really exciting to see how the film was able to generate interest in African cosmologies that from audiences who would be very opposed alternatively. And then I would say also just quickly is that there have been several other Igbo people who've been in the audience who've come up to me afterwards after seeing the showing, and they've shared how moved they were by the experience, that they've seen nothing like that, that it's one of the most powerful experiences they've ever seen in their life, is to see the story and to learn their creation myth for the first time in their life. And so I think that was also a really powerful expression for me of how it's having an impact within Igbo and Nigerian communities.
For me, I would say all of it has been unexpected. All of it, every last single piece has been completely surprising. I mean, it's interesting because I grew up in Macon, Georgia, and when I was younger, my parents actually owned an African-American art gallery. So I actually grew up, weirdly enough, with, all kinds of masks and statues and wood carvings and oil paintings and meeting artists and all this kind of stuff. Never associated that with myself, my life, my trajectory. Most of my career had been in the academy as a professor for a while, as an academic administrator. And so it really wasn't until the pandemic that I was forced to be inside like everyone else, but really using that time to say, okay, let's do a new project. Let's do something, I might not have had a chance to do before. Let's explore in this safe, contained way. And then now seeing this project move and go across the country, and I've subsequently left the job I was in, and now I'm a full-time artist working on additional art projects. All of that has been a complete shock, really. It was not something that was a part of my plan or my trajectory. But I think even like what we were saying before about the way these invocations and energy works, I mean, sometimes there are plans for you in your life that you are not always consciously aware of before they start to happen. So I think this film has been such an amazing part of my own life trajectory, my own destiny, and being able to have the space and belief to launch out into this new world and this new project. And it was interesting because even in an academic context, I was doing work on these same kinds of topics, but having to push up against various resistances, not having a specific academic audience to express these ideas to.
Absolutely.
But finding art a venue that's just much more open as far as the content of what you can produce and put out to the public with no barriers in the same way. I mean, you don't have to peer review a film before you just put it out. So it gives a freedom to like really let the power of the message and the work speak for itself. And it has been, and being able to see, even selling out Kelly Strayhorn last month was something that was, unexpected. Selling out anything. Of course, you go to academic talks, you might do a lecture, 10 people come, 30 if you're like really good. But right. To have almost 200 people show up, it just is humbling. And it just allows you to see such a scope of possibility.
And a little synchronicity. I lived in Warner Robins during high school. So I am very familiar with Macon, and I have some family that's actually from, like historically from Bibb County, from Perry. So hello, cousin.
Okay. Well, we might actually be related.
No, it's thick down there. Yeah. So my first 3 digits of my phone number is 478. Which is the area code, and it Absolutely. Never. I always have family I never met call the phone, and they're like, Sheila, and I'm like, this isn't Sheila's number. Oh, she must have changed it again. you from around here? Like, you know, like it's always finding each other wherever you go. So
absolutely.
Hello.
All right, 478, yes.
478, absolutely. So that concludes our conversation. Join us again April 29th for Crystal A. Smith's interview about her new publication. And I have such gratitude for your generosity, your intelligence, your curiosity, your courageousness, and just your innovative way of working together. This has been fabulous. You are all fabulous.
Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you again in some other context and continuing the conversation. Maybe we'll work on a project together. We'll see you at Lift Every Voice. So we'll definitely be in touch for sure. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you both. Dylan, you can sign us off.